The guests represented a cross-section of galactic high society, the sort of beings who had accumulated enough wealth to afford vacations that cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets. Crystalline Keth nobles refracted the resort's lighting into prismatic displays, while discussing art with the sort of passion that suggested they had strong opinions about the emotional resonance of geometric patterns. Vorthan collective minds had somehow achieved consensus on the need for individual relaxation, which they were pursuing through synchronized meditation sessions that looked like carefully choreographed sleeping. The staff moved through this chaos with the sort of professional efficiency that came from dealing with beings whose idea of reasonable behavior varied significantly across species. Riley had spent her first few days observing their procedures, noting escape routes, and trying to figure out what sort of emergency planning you did for a facility that had supposedly eliminated the possibility of emergencies. The answer, it turned out, was very little. The Suppression Field had made the resort's management remarkably complacent about traditional security concerns. Why plan for armed robbery when weapons couldn't function? Why worry about hostile takeovers when hostility itself was impossible? Why maintain extensive security staff when the technology itself provided perfect protection? It was the sort of confidence that made Riley professionally nervous, especially when she started noticing things that didn't quite fit the resort's carefully maintained atmosphere of peaceful luxury. The maintenance staff, for instance, seemed unusually well coordinated for beings whose job involved cleaning rooms and maintaining environmental systems. They moved with the sort of precision that suggested military training, and their work schedules seemed designed to provide comprehensive coverage of the resort's critical systems rather than efficient completion of maintenance tasks. Riley mentioned this observation to the resort's security chief, a Valorian whose job seemed to consist primarily of monitoring the Suppression Field status displays and looking important during staff meetings. He had dismissed her concerns with the sort of patience that suggested she was suffering from the paranoia that came from working in primitive security environments. The field makes such concerns irrelevant, he had explained, gesturing toward the displays that showed the suppression system operating at peak efficiency. Aggressive behavior is simply impossible within our operational radius. Even if someone wanted to cause trouble, they would find themselves psychologically incapable of acting on those impulses. Riley had thanked him for the clarification and made notes about the resort's confidence in its technological solutions. She had also quietly begun mapping the locations where the maintenance staff seemed to spend the most time, cross-referencing their schedules with the resort's operational routines. The attack came during the evening's entertainment period, when most of the guests were gathered in the central atrium watching a performance by crystalline musicians, whose music somehow managed to be both ethereally beautiful and mathematically precise. Riley was reviewing security protocols in her suite when the resort's communication system began broadcasting an announcement that was definitely not part of the scheduled programming. "Attention valued guests of the Celestial Oasis," a voice announced with the sort of cheerful professionalism that suggested extensive practice in customer service. "This facility is now under the temporary management of the Crimson Nebula Syndicate. Please remain calm while we transfer certain assets to our operational accounts." The Crimson Nebula Syndicate was, according to galactic law enforcement databases, exactly the sort of organization that gave piracy a bad name. They specialized in operations that combined military precision with creative interpretations of property law, targeting facilities where wealthy beings gathered in confined spaces with minimal security. They were also known for their innovative approaches to overcoming advanced security systems, though their methods usually involved significantly more explosions than the current situation seemed to warrant. Riley made her way toward the central atrium, moving through corridors that had suddenly become much less welcoming. The resort's elegant lighting now felt ominous, and the carefully controlled atmosphere seemed more like a trap than a luxury amenity. Emergency procedures were apparently limited to announcements advising guests to remain in their quarters while the situation was resolved through proper diplomatic channels. The scene in the atrium would have been almost comical if it weren't for the obvious distress of the guests. The pirates, for that's clearly what the maintenance staff had been all along, were moving through the crowd with professional efficiency, scanning personal items for valuables and transferring credits from personal accounts with the sort of routine competence that suggested they'd done this before. The suppression field was working perfectly. None of the pirates showed any signs of aggressive behavior. They were polite, efficient, and apologetic about the inconvenience they were causing. They explained their actions in reasonable tones, thanked guests for their cooperation, and even helped elderly beings to comfortable seating while their assets were being redistributed. The guests, meanwhile, were discovering that superior evolution hadn't prepared them for situations that couldn't be solved through technological superiority or strongly worded complaints to management. The Keth were refracting light in patterns that suggested extreme agitation, but couldn't seem to translate their distress into any form of effective action. The Vorthans had achieved perfect consensus that something should be done, but couldn't agree on what that something might be. Riley watched from the atrium's upper level, assessing the situation with the sort of professional detachment that came from working in environments where things went wrong with depressing regularity. The pirates had planned their operation with impressive attention to detail. They had infiltrated the resort over a period that suggested months of preparation, identified the most valuable targets among the guest population, and timed their operation to coincide with maximum occupancy. What they apparently hadn't planned for was someone who might not be affected by their carefully orchestrated psychological constraints. The suppression field worked by detecting and neutralizing aggressive neural patterns. It was a sophisticated system that could adapt to different species, account for various psychological configurations, and prevent violence through direct intervention in the decision-making process. What it couldn't do was suppress behaviors that didn't register as aggressive according to its programming parameters. Riley began her counter-operation with the resort's recreational facilities. The zero-gravity sculpting studio provided an excellent source of materials that weren't technically weapons according to any reasonable definition of the term. The magnetic manipulators used for shaping metal artworks could be repurposed as projectile launchers. The gravity generators themselves could be adjusted to create localized fields that would make movement difficult for anyone not prepared for sudden changes in gravitational orientation. The resort's kitchen facilities offered even more interesting possibilities. Industrial food processors could be modified to create what were essentially fragmentation devices. Pressure cookers became improvised explosives when combined with the cleaning supplies from the maintenance departments. Even the automated serving systems could be reprogrammed to deliver unpleasant surprises to specific locations. Riley's first target was the pirate coordinating asset transfers from the resort's financial systems. He was working from a terminal in the atrium's central hub, surrounded by the sort of advanced security displays that made hacking look like an elegant art form. He was also positioned directly beneath one of the resort's decorative water features, which included a gravity-fed circulation system that could be creatively redirected. The improvised device she constructed from kitchen supplies and artistic materials wasn't quite an explosive, but it produced a very satisfying bang when it deployed through the water feature's maintenance access. The resulting shower of pressurized cleaning solution was technically a malfunction of the resort's environmental systems rather than an attack, which meant the suppression field had no particular objection to its effects. The pirate found himself suddenly unable to see, breathe comfortably, or maintain his grip on the financial terminal, as various chemicals designed for industrial cleaning made contact with his respiratory system. He went down with the sort of surprised choking that suggested his planning hadn't included contingencies for environmental equipment failures. His companions immediately began looking for the source of the malfunction, but Riley had already moved to her next position. The resort's luxury amenities provided an almost unlimited source of materials that could be repurposed for purposes their designers had never considered. The spa's massage equipment, when combined with components from the fitness facilities, created devices that could deliver precisely controlled applications of force to specific anatomical locations. The recreational climbing wall's safety equipment became restraint systems. Even the zero-gravity recreational areas could be used to create situations where opponents found themselves unable to control their movement or orientation. The second pirate encountered Riley's improvised solutions when the automated massage table he was using to process stolen jewelry suddenly developed what appeared to be a software malfunction. The table's precision manipulation systems, designed to provide relaxing therapeutic pressure, began applying significantly less relaxing pressure to locations that were more strategic than therapeutic. By the time he managed to extract himself from the malfunctioning equipment, he was in no condition to continue his asset redistribution activities. The suppression field had no objection to therapeutic equipment experiencing technical difficulties, even when those difficulties resulted in someone being temporarily incapacitated by what was essentially a very aggressive medical treatment. The remaining pirates were beginning to realize that their perfectly planned operation was encountering variables they hadn't anticipated. Their leader, a being whose species Riley couldn't immediately identify, began issuing orders with the sort of urgency that suggested their timetable was no longer optimal. Riley responded by introducing additional complications to their operational environment. The resort's environmental systems were controlled by sophisticated automation that could adjust lighting, temperature, atmospheric composition, and even gravity on a room-by-room basis. With creative programming, these systems could create conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively hazardous for beings who weren't prepared for sudden changes in their environment. The atmospheric processors, when set to emergency purification mode, could fill designated areas with cleaning compounds that made breathing difficult. The lighting systems could be programmed to produce strobing effects that disrupted most species' visual processing. Even the temperature controls could be used to create localized conditions that would make normal movement difficult or impossible. Within minutes, the central atrium had become significantly less comfortable for everyone involved. The pirates found themselves operating in an environment that was simultaneously too bright, too dim, too hot, too cold, and filled with air that tasted like industrial solvent. The guests, protected by their personal environmental systems, were merely uncomfortable. The pirates, who had planned for security systems but not for the resort's own amenities being turned against them, were discovering that luxury facilities could become very inhospitable when their automated systems developed creative interpretations of guest comfort. Riley moved through this chaos with the sort of easy confidence that came from having created it. She had spent enough time in hostile environments to know that the key to winning unconventional conflicts was usually making sure your opponents were too busy dealing with immediate problems to execute their original plans. The pirate leader had taken position near the resort's main communications array, probably planning to coordinate with extraction vessels or additional team members. He was also standing directly beneath one of the resort's most impressive architectural features, a decorative fountain that used controlled gravity fields to create the illusion of water flowing upward in impossible spirals. Riley's modification to the fountain's control systems was subtle but effective. Instead of creating beautiful displays of liquid artistry, the gravity generators began producing localized fields that made standing upright considerably more challenging than normal physics would suggest. The pirate leader found himself experiencing the sort of gravitational confusion that made coherent thought difficult and coordinated movement nearly impossible. The improvised restraint system she deployed through the fountain's maintenance access wasn't quite a weapon, but it was very effective at keeping someone in a specific location while they contemplated the philosophical implications of being unable to determine which direction was up. The suppression field had no objection to decorative water features experiencing technical difficulties, even when those difficulties resulted in someone being temporarily immobilized by what was essentially a very elaborate practical joke. The remaining pirates, finding their leader trapped in a gravitational anomaly while their operational environment became increasingly hostile, made the sort of tactical decision that suggested their criminal enterprises hadn't prepared them for situations that couldn't be solved through conventional applications of violence or intimidation. They attempted to surrender. The problem was that the suppression field, having been designed to prevent aggressive behavior, had no particular protocol for processing surrender. The pirates found themselves psychologically incapable of expressing hostile intent, but they were also unable to clearly communicate their desire to cease their criminal activities. They ended up standing around looking confused while Riley continued to introduce additional complications to their situation. The resort's security forces finally arrived 45 minutes after the initial alert, by which time the situation had been resolved through what the official reports would diplomatically describe as environmental system malfunctions and equipment failures. They found 11 would-be pirates secured with restraints improvised from recreational equipment, one very calm human consultant sitting in the atrium's seating area, and several dozen wealthy alien guests who were staring at her with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their assumptions about technological superiority. The Valorian security chief surveyed the scene with the sort of bewilderment that came from witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible, according to his understanding of how the universe worked. His suppression field was operating at peak efficiency, preventing all forms of aggressive behavior exactly as designed. The problem was that it had never occurred to him that someone might achieve the same results as conventional violence without actually engaging in behavior that the system recognized as aggressive. "Who?" he asked, his elongated skull reflecting the atrium's emergency lighting in patterns that suggested intellectual distress. Riley gestured toward the various improvised devices and environmental modifications scattered throughout the area. "Your suppression field works perfectly," she said. "It prevented every form of aggressive behavior in this facility. Unfortunately, it defines aggressive behavior rather specifically." She stood up and walked over to where one of her improvised restraint systems was still maintaining a pirate in a state of therapeutic immobility. "This is a massage table, experiencing a software malfunction. This," she indicated the gravitational anomaly that was keeping the pirate leader in a state of philosophical confusion about the nature of up and down, "is a decorative fountain with a technical problem. And this," she gestured toward the atmospheric conditions that were making breathing an interesting challenge, "is environmental systems operating in emergency maintenance mode." The security chief stared at the devices, with the sort of expression beings developed when confronting evidence that their perfect solutions might have some definitional limitations. But these are not weapons. They are amenities." "Exactly," Riley agreed. "The thing about humans is that we come from a planet where the distinction between amenities and implements of violence has always been somewhat situational. We've been turning everyday objects into tools for solving problems for about as long as we've had problems that needed solving." She looked around the atrium at the assembled guests, many of whom were still processing the implications of what they had witnessed. "Your suppression field is an remarkable achievement. It does exactly what it was designed to do, and it does it very well. The issue is that it was designed by people who assumed that preventing aggressive behavior was the same thing as preventing effective problem-solving. The Crimson Nebula Syndicate," it emerged during the subsequent investigation, "had planned their operation with the sort of meticulous attention to detail that would have impressed military academies throughout the galaxy. They had studied the suppression field specifications, identified its operational parameters, and designed their approach to work within its constraints. They had planned for security forces, emergency protocols, and every form of technological countermeasure they could imagine. What they hadn't planned for was someone who could neutralize their operation using methods that didn't register as aggressive behavior according to the system's programming. They had assumed that preventing violence was the same thing as preventing resistance, and that beings protected by suppression fields would be helpless against anyone who could still act with purpose and determination. They had also been completely unprepared for the possibility that luxury resort amenities could be turned into an arsenal by someone with sufficient motivation and a flexible approach to equipment specifications. In the weeks that followed, as various security agencies analyzed the incident and updated their threat assessments, several interesting patterns emerged. Similar operations had been planned at other facilities throughout the sector, all of them protected by suppression field technology. The Syndicate had apparently identified what they believed was a fundamental vulnerability in the galaxy's most advanced peacekeeping systems. They had been right about the vulnerability, they had just been wrong about who might be able to exploit it. The Valorian Dominion, after extensive committee meetings, and the sort of bureaucratic deliberations that made diplomatic negotiations look decisive, issued a statement praising the effectiveness of their suppression technology, while quietly beginning research into what they diplomatically termed alternative behavioral response patterns. Early reports suggested the project was encountering some complex definitional challenges, particularly around the question of whether creative problem-solving should be classified as aggressive behavior or essential cognitive function. Riley returned to her regular consulting work, With a commendation for innovative security solutions and a reputation that made resort management throughout the galaxy somewhat more interested in traditional backup plans. She had, according to the official reports, demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness under pressure and creative thinking that reflected well on human adaptability in crisis situations. What the reports didn't mention was that she had also reminded everyone involved that the galaxy's most sophisticated peacekeeping technology was only as effective as the assumptions built into its programming. The Valorians had created a perfect system for preventing aggressive behavior, but they had forgotten that the most dangerous beings in the galaxy might not need to be aggressive to be effective. In the end, the neural suppression field had worked exactly as advertised. It had successfully prevented every form of aggressive behavior in the facility and maintained a peaceful environment throughout the entire incident. Not a single act of violence had occurred, and no one had been harmed through deliberate aggressive action. It had just never occurred to its designers that the most effective way to stop a criminal operation might not involve aggression at all. Some problems, it turned out, could be solved through pure creativity, applied physics, and the sort of lateral thinking that came from growing up on a planet where survival often depended on finding new uses for things that weren't designed for the uses you needed them for. The pirates had been absolutely correct about one thing: the suppression field made conventional resistance impossible. Unfortunately for them, they had encountered someone who didn't need conventional methods to achieve unconventional results. She just needed a luxury resort's worth of amenities and sufficient motivation to get creative with their intended purposes. The irony, Riley reflected as she reviewed her final security assessment, was that the Valorians' perfect peacekeeping technology had worked flawlessly. It had prevented exactly the sort of civilized technological violence that advanced species used to resolve their conflicts. What it hadn't prevented was the sort of creative, improvised problem-solving that came from beings who had learned to be effective long before they had learned to be sophisticated. In the galaxy's careful hierarchy of evolved civilizations, humans were still considered newcomers, primitive beings who had barely mastered interstellar travel and were still working on the basics of advanced social organization. But they had contributed something to the galactic community that the more sophisticated species had forgotten they needed: the ability to be dangerous without being violent, effective without being aggressive, and victorious using nothing more than creativity and the sort of stubborn refusal to accept that problems couldn't be solved. The suppression field had rendered her weapon completely useless. Her hands, and more importantly her willingness to use them creatively, had been more than sufficient to handle the situation. The Valorian Dominion had achieved something that philosophers and peacekeepers across the galaxy had dreamed of for millennia. They had made violence impossible. Not through enlightened discourse or spiritual evolution, those approaches were for species with more patience than sense, but through the sort of elegant technological solution that made everyone involved feel very clever about themselves. The neural suppression field was, according to Valorian marketing materials that read like love letters written by engineers, the ultimate expression of civilized progress. The technology worked by detecting and neutralizing the neural pathways associated with aggressive behavior, essentially turning anyone within its radius into the galactic equivalent of a strongly worded letter. Weapons became decorative objects. Military training became interpretive dance. Even the most bloodthirsty warrior became about as threatening as a philosophical debate about the nature of existence. It was, the Valorians claimed with the sort of smugness that came from having solved a problem everyone else was still working on, completely foolproof. The field operated at the quantum level, reading brainwave patterns and adjusting its suppression accordingly. It could distinguish between species, account for different neural architectures, and even adjust for individual psychological variations. No known form of intelligent life could overcome its effects through willpower, training, or sheer bloody-mindedness. The technology had been so successful that it was now standard equipment on any facility that catered to multiple species, particularly those where large amounts of wealth changed hands in enclosed spaces, which was how the Celestial Oasis had become the galaxy's premier luxury resort. a place where beings with more money than survival instincts could vacation without worrying about the sort of interpersonal violence that tended to break out when you put different species together in confined spaces with open bars. Riley Chen stood in the resort's opulent reception area, watching a Zephyrian concierge explain the suppression field's benefits to a group of newly arrived guests, with the sort of condescending patience typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. The concierge's elongated skull practically glowed with satisfaction as he described how the technology made their vacation experience completely safe from any form of aggressive behavior. Riley was there on business, conducting a security assessment for the resort's insurance company. It was the sort of routine evaluation that involved checking emergency procedures, reviewing staff training, and pretending that a facility protected by infallible technology might still need someone to think about what could go wrong. The job paid well enough to justify spending a week at a luxury resort, even if it meant listening to aliens explain how their superior technology had solved problems that primitive species like humans were still struggling with. The suppression field's effects on her sidearm had been immediate and absolute. The moment she'd crossed the resort's threshold, the weapon had become about as functional as an expensive paperweight. The field didn't just disable the firing mechanism, it somehow convinced the weapon's entire operational matrix that violence was simply not an option worth considering. Even the safety indicators had developed what could only be described as a philosophical objection to their intended purpose. Remarkable, isn't it? The concierge had approached with the sort of smile that species used when they wanted to share their cultural superiority. Your primitive projectile weapon has been rendered completely harmless. The field recognizes all forms of aggressive technology and neutralizes them at the neurological interface level. Riley had nodded politely and made appropriate noises about being impressed, because pointing out the various ways the system might be circumvented would have been considered rude. Besides, the Valorians had tested their technology against every known weapons system in the galaxy. They had data, statistics, and peer-reviewed studies that proved their field was absolutely impregnable against any form of violence. The resort itself was a monument to the sort of excess that happened when multiple species with too much money decided to compete over who could create the most impressive display of wealth. The central atrium soared through 7 levels of carefully climate-controlled luxury, with gravity generators that allowed guests to walk on walls and ceilings just for the novelty of it. Restaurants served cuisine from dozens of worlds, bars mixed drinks that defied several laws of chemistry, and recreational facilities offered everything from zero-gravity sculpture to competitive ecosystem management.